Today will be a bit of a departure from our usual Gulf Coast locale. Instead, we'll be heading onto the Guadalupe River in DeWitt County near Cuero, Texas. Today we'll be exploring the southern leg of the Guadalupe Valley Paddling Trail. The launch will be under the Highway 72 bridge approaching Cuero. Thanks to some recent improvements, the launch is much more straightforward than it used to be. In the past, getting the craft to and from the water was a feat of strength and logistics. Now, thankfully, there's a graded gravel path leading to the water's edge, and that's about it. This launch is pretty bare bones, made up only of a launch and parking area and no other amenities. Just a note, this is the middle launch out of the three that span the entire route's 13.8 miles. At present, it's the best option of origin by a wide margin, as the other two still prove quite challenging to traverse. For today's journey, we'll head south. Right off the bat, it's a pretty pristine paddle. There's plenty of greenery lining the towering riverbanks. You'll also have some rich sod and limestone banks for a change. It's definitely distinctive from the bayous I'm so used to paddling. There is some pretty substantial shelter from the wind along many stretches given the steeply elevated banks. But given its width, there are some areas where gusts were still pretty punishing. As a bayou paddler, I'm plenty used to wind, but less used to the currents that accompany the riverbound experience more substantially than my usual treks. As a result, I had to depend far more on intricate paddle work than normal to keep to the route on several occasions. This brings me to an aspect that might be viewed as pros to some and cons to others. Above all, I think it is primarily important information pertaining to paddlers unused to these conditions. The currents can be a bit deceiving in appearance. They were manageable for me, but I could see some novices prone to panic struggling and potentially being pitched into the bank. I'm sure there are other veteran river paddlers who could explain it better, but I've found that anxiety and rigidity in these scenarios often wind up with unfortunate results. You have to quite literally go with the flow. Here your paddles become less implements of propulsion and more implements of control and finesse. There are occasions where the water will refuse to cooperate with you, so you must cooperate with it. If possible, build up to these, as there's no substitute for experience. I wish I'd gotten more shots of the rapids, but I was worried about my equipment and didn't get the footage I thought I had. But there'll be more to come on that. Some experienced paddlers will no doubt find the rapids a draw rather than a deterrent. And to some used to whitewater, they might even seem mundane, but it's notable nonetheless. The only other thing that can be a downside is more a universal matter than having to do with this stretch of the Guadalupe itself. And that's the hazards that come when water levels are lower than the norm. You'll encounter plenty of river rocks, as well as large slate and limestone shales that can present challenges, especially when combined with rushing currents that often accompany the more substantial formations. Case in point, since my paddle was solo, I had to turn back at the waypoint and retrace all of those trouble areas. Going back upriver, I found a handful of occasions where rushing waters were too much for me to power through, especially since these were often the most shallow sections that would allow only the most shallow of paddle strokes. As a result, I had to ferry the kayak twice, which can be a bit fatiguing and slightly hazardous in some areas given the grade of the banks. It was definitely a learning experience on my part. And the main takeaway that I can convey to the GCK crew to get the most out of this route is to travel downriver only when possible. This is a great one to paddle with a friend so as to have two vehicles available for the one-way journey. Today's southern leg was 6 3/4 miles round trip. Aside from the aforementioned considerations, the rest was nice and peaceful. There were plenty of subtle curves to the route. You'll see a good variety of vegetation in this transition zone, where South Texas brush country meets coastal river bottomland. Bald cypress, live oak, elm, and cedar trees, along with hackberry and willows, seem to be most prevalent here and offer occasional shade spots to take a breather. As far as wildlife, I didn't encounter a ton, but I did see several red-tailed hawks, a couple kingfishers, 2 does, plenty of turtles, 1 turkey to mock me for the one that I missed on this morning's hunt, some cattle, and a few rolling gar. While the waters are not as clear as some of those spots in the hill country, it definitely has a more pleasant shade than the marshes and bayous of the Gulf Coast locales. Today's trip took me from Highway 72 down to Highway 77 and back. Note that there is an initial launch off of Highway 766 and Hell's Gate Road for those who want to experience it one way in its entirety as intended. It's well worth checking out, especially for those less used to the river bottom experience. Give it a shot. Paddle safe. God bless. Subscribe to GCK for the best in regional outdoors content.